David's hands were steady on the forklift controls as he maneuvered another pallet into position. The warehouse hummed with its usual afternoon rhythm. Diesel engines, beeping machinery, distant chatter of his crew wrapping up the day shift. He glanced at his phone. 4:47 p.m. Perfect timing. He could finish this last truck, grab Eli from daycare by 5:30, maybe stop at that ice cream place on Maple Street his 5-year-old had been asking about all week. 10 years of marriage, and David still felt that small surge of contentment thinking about his evening routine. Taylor would be home from her office job by 6. They'd have dinner together, maybe watch a movie after Eli went to bed. Simple, predictable, exactly the kind of stable life he'd wanted to build for his family. His phone buzzed. Taylor's name flashed on the screen, but when he answered, the voice was barely recognizable, high-pitched, frantic, dissolving into sobs. "David, oh God, David, you have to come to the hospital!" Taylor's voice was barely recognizable through her panic. The forklift jerked to a stop. "What? Taylor, what happened? Are you hurt?" David demanded. "It's Eli. I mean, he's okay, but the police... David, I need you here right now. St. Mary's emergency. Please, just come," she sobbed before the line went dead. David's mind went blank for exactly 3 seconds. Then training kicked in, the same methodical thinking that had made him a shift supervisor. He shut down the forklift, grabbed his keys, and called out to his assistant manager as he ran toward the exit. The drive to St. Mary's took 12 minutes that felt like hours. David's hands gripped the steering wheel as his mind cycled through every parent's catalog of fears. But Taylor had said Eli was okay, so maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe just a broken arm, stitches, something scary but manageable. He should have known better. In 10 years of marriage, he'd never heard Taylor sound like that, not even when her father had his heart attack. This was different. This was terror. David burst through the sliding doors and saw them immediately. Taylor huddled in a waiting room chair, flanked by 2 police officers and a woman in a business suit. Taylor's face was red and swollen, mascara streaked down her cheeks, but she wasn't hurt. She was talking rapidly to one of the officers, gesturing with her hands. "Where's my son?" David's voice cut across the room like a blade. The woman in the suit, social worker David realized with growing dread, approached him with careful, measured steps. "Mr. Mitchell? I'm Susan Rodriguez from Child Protective Services. Your son is safe. He's with the nurses right now getting checked out, but he's physically unharmed," she said calmly. "Physically unharmed?" David's voice rose. "What the hell does that mean?" Taylor stood up, reaching for him with shaking hands. "David, I can explain," she started desperately. "Ma'am, please sit down," the older police officer interrupted, gesturing Taylor back to her chair. His expression was professional but cold. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Sergeant Williams. Your wife left your 5-year-old son unattended in a locked vehicle for approximately 2.5 hours this afternoon. The child was discovered by neighbors who heard him crying and called 911. When we arrived, the interior temperature was 94 degrees. Your son was dehydrated and distressed." The words hit David like physical blows. "That's impossible. Taylor would never," he protested. "Mr. Mitchell, your wife has admitted to leaving the child in the car while she was inside a residence on Elm Street. She's been arrested for child endangerment," Sergeant Williams stated matter-of-factly. David looked at Taylor, really looked at her for the first time since arriving. Her blouse was wrinkled, buttoned wrong. Her hair was messed up. There was something else, too. A smell, faint but unmistakable. Men's cologne that wasn't his. "Whose house?" David's voice came out quieter than he intended. Taylor's face crumpled. "David, please," she whispered. "Whose house, Taylor?" he repeated, his voice hardening. Sergeant Williams consulted his notepad. "The residence belongs to Nathan Brooks. Your wife states they work together." The puzzle pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Nathan Brooks. Taylor had mentioned him before, her new project manager, the guy she'd been working late with. The reason for all those recent overtime hours, the new attention to her appearance, The way she'd started keeping her phone face down during dinner. David closed his eyes and saw it all. Eli strapped into his car seat, confused at first, then scared, then crying as the car got hotter and no one came. While his mother was inside another man's house, betraying everything David thought he knew about their life together. "I want to see my son," David said quietly. "Of course. Room 3. The doctor wants to keep him for observation, but he should be fine to go home tonight," Susan Rodriguez replied. David started toward the hallway, then stopped and turned back to Taylor. She looked up at him with desperate hope. "I'm pressing charges," David said quietly. "Full prosecution." Taylor's face went white. "David, you don't understand," she pleaded. "I understand perfectly." He looked at Sergeant Williams. "What do I need to do?" "We'll need a statement from you, sir, and you'll want to contact a family attorney as soon as possible," the sergeant advised. David nodded and headed toward room 3. Behind him, he could hear Taylor sobbing, but the sound felt distant, irrelevant. His marriage was over, had been over the moment Taylor made her choice. Now David had only one job, protecting Eli from ever being put in that position again. Eli was sitting up in the hospital bed when David walked in, looking small against the white sheets but alert. His face lit up when he saw his father. "Daddy, I was in the car and it got really hot and scary, but the police came and they had cool water," Eli said with the matter-of-fact tone children use for traumatic events. David sat on the edge of the bed and gathered his son into his arms, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I know, buddy. I'm so sorry that happened to you." "Where's Mommy?" Eli asked innocently. David looked into his son's trusting eyes and felt something fundamental shift inside him. Not breaking, but hardening into something stronger and more dangerous. "Mommy made some bad choices today," David said carefully. "But Daddy's here now, and I'm going to make sure you're safe." 2 hours later, David sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot, Eli asleep in his car seat. He pulled out his phone and dialed Taylor's parents' house. Her father answered on the second ring. "Hello, Jim. It's David," he said calmly. "David, son, I'm so glad you called. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding," Jim began hopefully. "It's not a misunderstanding, Jim. Your daughter left my 5-year-old son locked in a car while she f***ed another man. She's lucky he didn't die," David cut him off bluntly. Silence stretched across the line. "I want you to know that I'm filing for divorce and full custody. Taylor will have supervised visitation only if she's lucky. And Jim, if you or Margaret try to interfere with that in any way, you'll never see Eli again," David continued coldly. David hung up and stared out at the parking lot, processing the complete destruction of his old life. Tomorrow he would start building something new, something harder and more protective. He wasn't the same man who had answered Taylor's phone call 4 hours ago. That man had been trusting, forgiving. This man was something different entirely. David started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot, heading home to begin planning his war. David woke up at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of Eli calling for his mother. It was the 3rd time that night. Nightmares, completely normal after a traumatic experience. David found his son sitting up in bed, small face pinched with confusion. "Where's Mommy, Daddy?" Eli asked with sleepy confusion. It was the same question Eli had asked 6 times yesterday. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his mother had put his life at risk for an affair? "Mommy's staying at Grandma and Grandpa's house for a while," David said gently, settling onto the edge of the bed. "Remember what we talked about? Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices and have to face consequences." Eli nodded solemnly. "Is she coming back?" "I don't know, buddy, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere," David assured him. After breakfast and dropping Eli at daycare, with a long conversation about pickup procedures and who was authorized to collect Eli, David drove to the law offices of Patricia and Associates. Patricia wasn't a relative, just a coincidence that had made her easy to remember when his brother-in-law had recommended her during his own messy divorce. Patricia's office was all clean lines and expensive furniture, announcing competence before she even spoke. She was younger than David had expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and focused intensity that suggested she didn't lose cases often. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, gesturing to a chair, "Rick filled me in on the basics, but I need to hear everything from you." David laid out the timeline methodically. Taylor's changed behavior over the past 3 months, the late nights, the new attention to her appearance, the phone calls she took in private, then yesterday's emergency call, the hospital, the police report, the full scope of what had happened. Patricia took notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking for clarification. When David finished, she leaned back and studied him. "This is actually much stronger than most cases I handle," she said with professional satisfaction. "Criminal charges change everything. Child endangerment, especially in the context of an extramarital affair, creates a narrative that family court judges find particularly damning." "What are my options?" David asked directly. "Full custody. Supervised visitation only for your wife, at least initially. And given the circumstances, we can move for emergency orders that go into effect immediately, before she has time to mount a defense or hide assets," Patricia explained. Patricia outlined the strategy. Emergency custody orders filed that afternoon. Temporary restraining orders preventing Taylor from taking Eli anywhere without David's written consent and court supervision. Asset protection measures to freeze joint accounts and document all marital property. "The criminal case strengthens our position enormously," Patricia continued. "But I need you to understand, this approach is aggressive. Once we file these motions, there's no going back to friendly divorce negotiations. You're declaring war." David thought about Eli in that overheated car, crying and scared while his mother was inside another man's house. "Good. How much is this going to cost?" "My retainer is $15,000. A case like this, if it goes to trial, could run $30,000 to $40,000 total," she stated. David nodded. He had the money. 10 years of careful saving, the college fund, their emergency account. Ironically, Taylor's affair was going to cost her everything they'd built together. "Do it," he said firmly. Patricia smiled, and David caught a glimpse of why Rick had described her as ruthless. "I'll have the emergency motions filed by close of business today. Now let's talk about evidence." The next 3 hours were dedicated to building an airtight case. David provided copies of the police report, hospital records, witness statements from the neighbors who had called 911. Patricia's assistant helped him organize financial documents, bank statements, investment accounts, Taylor's recent credit card bills that showed charges at expensive restaurants and clothing stores David didn't recognize. "This is interesting," Patricia said, studying Taylor's credit card statement. "Multiple charges at Victoria's Secret over the past 2 months, all on days she claimed to be working late. A hotel charge downtown 3 weeks ago, the Marriott. That's not where her office is." David felt sick looking at the evidence of his wife's deception laid out in black and white, but he forced himself to study each item objectively. This wasn't about his feelings anymore. This was about protecting his son. They also discussed Eli's well-being. Patricia recommended a child psychologist who specialized in custody cases, someone who could document any psychological impact and provide professional testimony about what custody arrangement would be in Eli's best interests. "Judge Morrison handles most family cases in this county," Patricia explained. "She's tough but fair, and she has zero tolerance for parents who put their romantic lives ahead of their children's safety." By the time David left Patricia's office, he felt something he hadn't experienced since answering Taylor's call. Control. Not over what Taylor had done, that damage was permanent, but over what happened next. He picked up Eli from daycare and drove to Dr. Sarah Martinez's office, the child psychologist Patricia had recommended. Dr. Martinez was kind but professional, explaining to Eli that sometimes kids needed to talk to someone about confusing or scary things. While Eli played with toys, Dr. Martinez spoke quietly with David. He's showing classic signs of anxiety, difficulty sleeping, regression in some behaviors, hypervigilance about when you're leaving and coming back. All normal responses to trauma, but we want to address them early. How long will this affect him? David asked with concern. That depends on several factors. Stability in his living situation will help enormously. Consistency from his primary caregiver, that's you, is crucial. And honestly, limiting exposure to the parent who caused the trauma until she can demonstrate changed behavior is usually recommended, Dr. Martinez explained professionally. David nodded, another professional opinion supporting full custody. That evening, after Eli was asleep, David sat at his kitchen table with Taylor's belongings still scattered around the house. Tomorrow he would pack all of it up and have it delivered to her parents' house. Tonight, he had calls to make. First, he called his brother Mike, who listened without interruption. Mike's response was immediate. Whatever you need, David. Money, childcare, someone to punch Nathan Brooks in the face, just say the word. Then his parents in Arizona, who were shocked into silence. His mother cried. His father, a retired police officer, asked pointed questions about the criminal charges and expressed grim satisfaction that David was pressing full prosecution. Finally, David called his supervisor and explained that he would need time off for legal proceedings. 10 years of reliable service had earned him considerable goodwill, and his boss immediately approved emergency leave. By 11 p.m., David had a clear picture of his support network rallying around him. His legal strategy was aggressive and well-funded. His son was getting professional help, and Taylor was staying with her parents, facing criminal charges, looking at losing everything she'd taken for granted. David walked through his house, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't the home he'd shared with his wife anymore. It was the fortress he was building to protect his son. He wasn't the trusting husband who had believed his wife's explanations about working late. That man was gone, replaced by someone harder and more protective. Someone who understood that sometimes love meant being ruthless with people who threatened the ones you were sworn to protect. Tomorrow, Patricia would file the emergency motions. Tomorrow, Taylor would discover that her choices had consequences. Tomorrow, David would begin the systematic dismantling of the life his cheating wife had thrown away. The emergency custody hearing took place in Judge Morrison's courtroom on a Thursday morning, 1 week after Taylor's arrest. David sat beside Patricia, watching as Taylor entered with her court-appointed attorney, a harried-looking public defender named Robert Kim, who was clearly overwhelmed by the case's complexity. Taylor looked smaller than David remembered, wearing a conservative blue dress her mother had probably chosen. Her face was pale and drawn, and she avoided making eye contact with David across the aisle. Good. She should be afraid. Judge Morrison was exactly as Patricia had described, a stern woman in her 50s who reviewed the case file with obvious disapproval. She looked up at Taylor over her reading glasses. Mrs. Mitchell, you've been charged with child endangerment in connection with leaving your 5-year-old son unattended in a locked vehicle for over 2 hours. Is that correct? The judge asked sternly. Yes, Your Honor, but I can explain, Taylor began desperately. The time for explanations was before you left your child in danger while conducting an extramarital affair, Judge Morrison cut her off sharply. Ms. Patricia, I've reviewed your emergency motions. What are you seeking? Patricia stood smoothly. Your Honor, we're requesting immediate sole legal and physical custody for Mr. Mitchell, with supervised visitation only for Mrs. Mitchell. We're also requesting a temporary restraining order preventing Mrs. Mitchell from taking the minor child anywhere without written consent from Mr. Mitchell and court supervision. Grounds? The judge inquired. The police report clearly establishes that Mrs. Mitchell prioritized her extramarital affair over her child's safety, resulting in criminal charges. We have documentation from the child's therapist indicating ongoing trauma. Most importantly, Mrs. Mitchell's judgment regarding the child's well-being has been fundamentally compromised, Patricia explained methodically. Judge Morrison turned to Robert Kim. "Counselor?" Kim stood, shuffling through papers. "Your Honor, my client made a mistake, but she loves her son and has been a devoted mother for 5 years. This was an isolated incident," he argued weakly. "An isolated incident that could have killed a child," Judge Morrison interrupted coldly, "and occurred during the commission of adultery, which speaks to a pattern of poor judgment and misplaced priorities." David watched Taylor's face crumble as the judge's words hit home. Part of him felt a flicker of sympathy. After all, he'd loved this woman for 10 years. But then he thought about Eli crying in that overheated car, and the sympathy vanished. The hearing lasted 45 minutes. When it was over, Judge Morrison had granted every motion Patricia had filed. David had sole custody. Taylor was restricted to supervised visitation twice a week at a court-approved facility. She couldn't take Eli anywhere without David's written permission and a court supervisor present. "The court finds that Mrs. Mitchell's conduct demonstrates a fundamental failure of parental judgment," Judge Morrison stated for the record. "Until such time as she can demonstrate through counseling, parenting classes, and consistent behavior that she can prioritize her child's safety over her own desires, custody will remain with Mr. Mitchell." Taylor was sobbing quietly by the time the judge finished. Her attorney tried to console her, but David could see the man was already mentally moving on to his next case. Taylor couldn't afford a real lawyer, and they both knew it. Outside the courthouse, Patricia handed David a copy of the official order. "This gives you complete control over Eli's life until the divorce is final. She can't make educational decisions, medical decisions, nothing. And David? She's going to try to negotiate. Don't give her anything." "What do you mean?" David asked. "She'll call you. Probably tonight. She'll cry, apologize, maybe threaten suicide, try to make you feel guilty for destroying her life. Remember, she destroyed her own life the moment she left Eli in that car," Patricia warned. Patricia was right. Taylor called that evening while David was reading bedtime stories to Eli. "David, please, we need to talk." Taylor's voice was desperate through the phone. "We have nothing to discuss. If you want to communicate about Eli, go through your attorney," David replied coldly. "I don't have an attorney anymore. I can't afford one. My parents are already stretched thin with the bail money and—" she pleaded. "That's not my problem," he interrupted. "David, please. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I love you. I love Eli. We can work through this," Taylor continued desperately. David looked at his son, finally calm and sleepy after another day of asking when Mommy was coming home. "You had 10 years to think about what you wanted, Taylor. You chose Nathan Brooks." "That's over. It was never serious, just—" she tried to explain. "Just serious enough to risk our son's life for," David cut her off harshly. The silence stretched between them. "The supervised visitation starts Saturday," David continued matter-of-factly. 2 hours, 10 a.m. to noon, at the Family Services Center on Oak Street. Don't be late." He hung up and blocked her number. Meanwhile, the criminal case was proceeding independently. David had met with the prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Jennifer Walsh, who seemed genuinely angry about what Taylor had done. "Child endangerment cases involving affairs are particularly egregious," Walsh had explained. "The defendant made a conscious choice to prioritize her romantic life over her child's safety." But Taylor's public defender was pushing for a plea bargain. Guilty to child endangerment, probation instead of jail time, mandatory parenting classes, and community service. Walsh recommended David accept it. "She'll have a criminal record, which strengthens your custody case permanently," she pointed out pragmatically. David agreed to the plea, but only after extracting maximum advantage. As part of the agreement, Taylor had to admit guilt publicly, accept responsibility for endangering Eli, and agree to extended probation with regular drug and alcohol testing. The ripple effects were spreading beyond just David's family. Nathan Brooks's wife had filed for divorce after learning about the affair through the police report, which had become public record. Nathan was also facing disciplinary action at work, conducting a personal affair during company time, using company resources. David learned about Nathan's troubles through a mutual acquaintance at Taylor's office, and he felt grim satisfaction. He hadn't needed to destroy Nathan personally. The man's poor choices were destroying him naturally. That was how real consequences worked. They cascaded through every area of life. The property settlement was where David's methodical approach really paid off. With Taylor's legal position severely weakened and her inability to afford competent representation, Patricia was able to negotiate from overwhelming strength. David kept the house. Eli needed stability. David kept the primary vehicle. He was the only one responsible for transporting Eli. Taylor's credit card debts from her affair period became her sole responsibility. The college fund remained intact and under David's control. "She's basically starting over with nothing," Patricia explained as they reviewed the settlement terms. "Her parents' house, a part-time job if she can find one, supervised visitation twice a week. Her affair cost her everything." 3 weeks after the custody hearing, David ran into Taylor's mother at the grocery store. Margaret approached him hesitantly. "David, I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but Taylor is falling apart. She barely gets out of bed. She cries constantly. I'm worried about her mental health," Margaret said with genuine concern. David looked at Margaret steadily. "She should talk to her therapist about that." "You were married for 10 years. Doesn't that mean anything?" she challenged. "It meant everything. That's why what she did is unforgivable," David replied firmly. Margaret's face flushed with anger. "You're destroying her life over one mistake." "She destroyed her own life, and she nearly destroyed Eli's," David interrupted, his voice staying calm and controlled. "Margaret, I'm going to say this once. Taylor made a choice to prioritize her affair over her son's safety. That choice had consequences. I didn't create those consequences. I'm just ensuring they're enforced." He walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the cereal aisle. That night, as David tucked Eli into bed, his son asked the question he'd been avoiding. "Daddy, why can't Mommy live here anymore?" Eli asked innocently. David sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt people they love. When that happens, there have to be consequences." "Did Mommy hurt me?" Eli asked with childlike directness. "Yes, buddy. She did, but not on purpose, and not because she doesn't love you," David explained gently. Eli considered this seriously. "Are you going to hurt me?" "Never. My job is to protect you, always," David promised firmly. Eli nodded and rolled over, satisfied. David sat in the dark for a few more minutes, listening to his son's breathing even out into sleep. The old David, the trusting husband who had believed in second chances, might have felt guilty about Taylor's destruction. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who understood that protecting his child meant being harder than he'd ever thought possible. Tomorrow, Taylor would have her supervised visit with Eli. She would cry, try to explain herself to a 5-year-old who couldn't understand adult betrayal. And David would watch from the waiting room, ensuring his son's safety while his ex-wife faced the consequences of her choices. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. The criminal court hearing took place on a cold Tuesday morning in November, 4 months after Taylor's arrest. David sat in the gallery with Patricia, watching as Taylor stood before Judge Harrison in a borrowed black suit, her hands shaking as she waited to learn her fate. The courtroom was nearly empty. Just David, Patricia, the prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, Taylor's public defender Robert Kim, and Taylor's parents in the back row. The local newspaper had sent a reporter, drawn by the combination of adultery and child endangerment. Judge Harrison reviewed the case file with obvious disgust, his expression growing darker as he read through the police reports, hospital records, and witness statements. When he finally looked up at Taylor, his voice carried moral authority. "Mrs. Mitchell, The evidence shows that you left your 5-year-old son locked in a vehicle for 2 hours and 37 minutes while you engaged in an extramarital affair. The interior temperature reached 94 degrees. Your child was found by neighbors who heard him crying and called 911. He was dehydrated, distressed, and could have died, the judge stated gravely. Taylor's attorney had prepared her well. She stood straight, made eye contact with the judge, and spoke clearly when asked how she pleaded. "Guilty, Your Honor," Taylor said with forced composure. Judge Harrison nodded grimly. "The court accepts your plea. Mrs. Mitchell, you will serve 18 months supervised probation. You will complete 200 hours of community service at a child advocacy center. You will attend mandatory parenting classes and anger management counseling. You will submit to random drug and alcohol testing, and you will pay all court costs and restitution." He leaned forward, his voice making everyone in the courtroom straighten in their seats. "Let me be absolutely clear, Mrs. Mitchell. Your conduct represents a fundamental failure of parental responsibility. You placed your selfish desires above your child's safety and well-being. Only through the intervention of concerned neighbors did your son survive an incident that kills dozens of children every year." Taylor nodded tearfully, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "I want you to understand something. This court has seen parents who made mistakes, forgot a child in a car during distraction, left a child briefly while handling an emergency. That's not what happened here. You made a deliberate, calculated decision to abandon your child in potentially lethal conditions so you could commit adultery. That's not a mistake. That's a choice that reveals your character," the judge continued with mounting intensity. David felt grim satisfaction as Taylor's face crumpled. The judge had articulated exactly what David felt. This wasn't about forgiveness or second chances. This was about the type of person who would risk their child's life for an affair. After the criminal hearing, the real victory came in family court, where Judge Morrison was finalizing the divorce decree. David's methodical preparation over the past 4 months had created an overwhelming case. Patricia had compiled a comprehensive file: the criminal conviction, documentation of Taylor's ongoing financial instability, reports from Eli's therapist showing continued improvement in David's sole custody, and evidence that Taylor had violated several minor provisions of the temporary orders. Taylor's new attorney, a recent law school graduate working for Legal Aid, was clearly outmatched. She made a valiant effort to argue for expanded visitation and shared legal custody, but Judge Morrison cut her off. "Counselor, I've read the file. Mrs. Mitchell was convicted of child endangerment this morning. She's on probation for risking her son's life during an extramarital affair. What possible argument could you make for expanding her access to this child?" the judge asked with barely concealed contempt. Judge Morrison's final ruling was comprehensive and devastating for Taylor. David received sole legal and physical custody of Eli. Taylor's visitation remained supervised until she completed all court-mandated counseling and could demonstrate sustained behavioral change. She had no input on educational, medical, or major life decisions for Eli. The marital property settlement heavily favored David. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Morrison stated for the record, "your conduct demonstrates a pattern of prioritizing your romantic relationships over your child's welfare. Until you can prove through sustained action that you've changed your priorities, this court will not risk further harm to this child." The property settlement reflected Taylor's completely weakened legal position. David kept their 4-bedroom colonial where Eli had grown up. Taylor's affair-related credit card debts became her sole responsibility. The college fund remained intact and under David's exclusive control. Taylor's financial situation was dire. Her parents had exhausted their savings on bail and legal fees. Her part-time retail job barely covered rent on a studio apartment. Her supervised visitation required payment to the court-approved facility, another expense she could barely afford. "She's essentially starting over with nothing," Patricia explained as they reviewed the final decree. "No assets, significant debt, supervised access to her child twice a week. Her affair cost her everything she'd built over 10 years of marriage." The ripple effects had continued spreading. Nathan Brooks's divorce had been finalized, his ex-wife receiving their house and primary custody of their 2 children. Nathan had been demoted at work after an internal investigation. He'd been forced to move in with his brother, his career prospects damaged by the scandal. David took no active pleasure in Nathan's downfall, but he felt deep satisfaction that actions had consequences. Character flaws that led to one type of betrayal inevitably led to others. 2 months after the final divorce decree, David encountered a situation that tested his resolve. He was picking up Eli from supervised visitation when he overheard Taylor talking to the court supervisor. "I've completed the parenting classes and anger management," Taylor was saying hopefully. "My therapist says I'm making good progress. When can we discuss expanding my visitation?" The supervisor, Linda Wells, reviewed Taylor's file carefully. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've been compliant with the immediate requirements, but the court ordered sustained behavioral change. That means demonstrating over time that you can prioritize Eli's needs consistently." "How much time?" Taylor asked with growing desperation. "That's up to Judge Morrison, but typically cases like yours require at least a year of demonstrated stability," Linda explained professionally. David watched Taylor's face as the reality hit her. She would have limited access to her son for at least another 8 months, possibly longer. Part of him felt a flicker of sympathy. But then Eli ran to him from the play area, chattering excitedly about the puzzle he'd completed, and David remembered what mattered. His son was thriving in the stability David provided. Eli's nightmares had stopped. His separation anxiety had diminished. He was sleeping through the night, laughing during the day, secure in the knowledge that his father would always prioritize his safety. That evening, as David helped Eli with homework at their kitchen table, his son asked a question that surprised him. "Daddy, why does Mommy always cry when I see her?" Eli asked with innocent curiosity. David considered his answer carefully. "Mommy is sad because she misses living with us, but sometimes when grown-ups make bad choices, they have to live with the consequences for a long time." "Will she ever stop being sad?" Eli wondered. "I don't know, buddy. That depends on whether she can learn from her mistakes," David answered honestly. Eli nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to complex situations. "I'm glad you make good choices, Daddy." The simple statement hit David harder than any judge's ruling or legal victory. This was what it had all been about. Not revenge against Taylor, but protection for Eli. Creating a life where his son could trust that his primary caregiver would always put his safety first. Walking out of the courthouse after the final hearing, David felt something he hadn't experienced since Taylor's arrest. Complete peace. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just quiet contentment that came from knowing his son was protected and justice had been served. Taylor had destroyed her marriage, her relationship with her son, her financial security, and her reputation. But David hadn't destroyed her. She had destroyed herself through her choices. He had simply ensured that those choices had appropriate consequences. That evening, David sat on his back porch while Eli played in the yard, watching his son chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The boy was happy, secure, thriving in the stability David had fought to provide. David's phone buzzed with a text from his brother Mike. "How did the hearing go?" "Complete victory," David replied. "Justice served." He put the phone away and called Eli inside for bath time, ready to continue the work of being the father his son deserved. Protective, consistent, and always willing to do whatever it took to keep his child safe. 18 months after the final custody hearing, David and Eli had settled into a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable. Eli saw his mother once a week for 2 hours at the supervised visitation center, but he no longer asked when she was coming home. Home was the house he shared with his father, where bedtime stories happened on schedule and promises were always kept. Taylor had completed her probation successfully and found steady work as a receptionist at a dental office across town. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, her social life limited by financial constraints and the reputation that followed her conviction. David occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances. Taylor was seeing a therapist regularly, had cut contact with Nathan Brooks entirely, seemed to be trying to rebuild her life on more solid ground. He felt no satisfaction in her struggles, but no sympathy either. Actions had consequences, and Taylor was living with hers the same way David was living with his. The difference was that David's consequences had made him stronger and more protective, while Taylor's had left her isolated and diminished. The financial settlement had provided David and Eli with comfortable stability. The house was fully theirs, the college fund had continued growing, and David's careful asset management had created genuine security for his son's future. Taylor's financial struggles were her own responsibility, the natural result of spending marital assets on an affair. Nathan Brooks had moved to another state after his own divorce finalized, his career damaged and his relationship with his children strained by the scandal. Character flaws, David reflected, had a way of revealing themselves in every relationship. On a warm Saturday afternoon in early spring, David and Eli drove to the baseball stadium for a father-son game. It had become their tradition, just the two of them, sharing nachos and root beer while cheering for the home team. Eli wore his lucky cap and brought his glove, still optimistic about catching a foul ball. "Dad," Eli said during the seventh-inning stretch, "remember when you promised you'd never leave me like Mommy did?" David looked at his son, 9 years old now, gap-toothed and sunburned and completely secure in his father's love. "I remember." "You kept your promise," Eli said with satisfaction. "I always will, buddy," David promised firmly. Eli nodded with satisfaction and turned back to the game, cheering as the home team loaded the bases. David watched his son's animated face and felt the deep contentment that came from knowing he'd done the right thing, even when it had been difficult. The crowd erupted as the home team scored, and Eli jumped up to cheer with everyone else. David stood too, one hand on his son's shoulder, both of them looking forward instead of back. In the parking lot after the game, walking toward their truck with Eli chattering about the game-winning hit, David reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed David's capacity for strategic thinking when his child's well-being was at stake. The love for his son had only grown deeper, fiercer, more unshakable with every passing day. And that, David knew, was the only victory that really mattered. "Can we get ice cream on the way home?" Eli asked as they reached the truck. "Absolutely," David said, unlocking the doors. "Same place as always?" "Same place as always," Eli confirmed with enthusiasm, climbing into his booster seat. David started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the ice cream shop on Maple Street where this whole story had begun almost 4 years earlier. The man who had planned to stop there after work on the day Taylor's call changed, everything was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more protective. But the love for his son remained constant, the foundation upon which David had built their new life together. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a thumbs up and drop a comment below. Your support helps the algorithm push my content further. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep creating more stories for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.